Welcome to Echoes of Africa, where hidden stories, bold voices, and untold truths rise from the heart of the continent. Before you dive in, hit subscribe and turn on the bell, because every echo here reveals the Africa they don't want you to see. Africa is no longer just participating in global culture. Africa is rewriting it, reshaping it, and exporting it at a pace the world never expected. And while many still view the continent through the old lenses of struggle and aid, a silent but unstoppable cultural revolution has been unfolding across music, fashion, and film, turning African creativity into one of the most influential cultural forces of the 21st century. And the truth is, most people don't even realize how deep this takeover already goes, because they are hearing African sounds daily, wearing African-inspired designs, and watching African-inspired stories without fully understanding where it all began or where it's heading next. And this is not just a trend, it is a global shift in cultural power. For decades, African music existed mostly in local spaces, radio stations, weddings, street corners, and small clubs. But in the last 10 to 15 years, African music, especially Afrobeats, Amapiano, and Afrofusion, has crossed from being a regional sound into a dominant global force. And it didn't happen by accident. It happened because African artists refused to imitate the West and instead exported their own identity, rhythm, and stories to the world on their own terms. When artists like Burna Boy, Wizkid, Davido, Tems, Ira Star, Asake, Rema, Tyla, and Black Coffee started selling out stadiums in Europe and North America, it wasn't just about popularity. It was about cultural influence shifting direction. Because for the first time in modern music history, global audiences were adapting themselves to African sounds instead of Africans adapting to Western sounds. And this is one of the most powerful cultural changes of our generation. Afrobeats is no longer just a genre. It's a global language. It influences pop music, hip-hop, dancehall, reggaeton, and even K-pop, with global stars like Drake, Beyoncé, Ed Sheeran, Justin Bieber, and Rihanna collaborating directly with African artists and producers, not out of charity, but because African sound now controls the pulse of youth culture worldwide. Streaming platforms like Spotify, Apple Music, and YouTube show this clearly. African songs are entering global charts, topping international playlists, and shaping listening habits in cities from London to Los Angeles, from Paris to Tokyo. And what makes this moment historic is that African artists are not abandoning their roots to rise, they are rising specifically because of their roots. And then there is Amapiano, the deep hypnotic South African genre that went from township beats to international club dominance, spreading across Europe, Asia, and North America, influencing DJs, producers, and dance culture worldwide, while keeping its identity deeply rooted in African street culture, showing that Africa is not just exporting music. Africa is exporting lifestyle, movement, and rhythm. But Africa's cultural explosion is not limited to sound. It has also completely transformed global fashion. And if you look closely, you'll see that African design, color, patterns, and aesthetics now dominate major global runways, luxury brands, streetwear culture, and celebrity styling. African fashion is no longer treated as ethnic or niche. It's now considered elite, innovative, and trend-setting, with designers from Nigeria, Ghana, Senegal, Kenya, South Africa, and Côte d'Ivoire redefining what modern global fashion looks like, from high fashion to street culture. Brands like Off-White under the late Virgil Abloh, who had Ghanaian roots, and designers like Duro Oluwafemi Magidi, Kenneth Ismail, and Christy Brown have helped push African-inspired aesthetics into the mainstream. And today, African fabrics like Osso Oak, Kent Ankara, and Adire are no longer just cultural garments, they are luxury statements worn by global celebrities, models, and fashion icons. You now see African prints and silhouettes on red carpets, in Vogue editorials, in Paris Fashion Week, New York Fashion Week, Milan, and London, not as costumes, but as premium global fashion statements. And this matters because fashion is not just clothing. Fashion is identity, power, and perception. And Africa is reclaiming its global image through its own aesthetics. More importantly, Africa is no longer just giving the world inspiration. It is controlling production chains, building its own fashion houses, textile industries, and creative startups, which means the cultural influence is also becoming economic power, creating jobs, industries, and new global brands that are African-owned and African-led. And then we have African film, which has undergone one of the most dramatic cultural transformations of all, with Nollywood becoming the second largest film industry in the world by volume, surpassing Hollywood in production numbers, and proving that African storytelling has both local depth and global demand. And these companies are investing millions into African storytelling because they recognize that Africa's stories are not just local stories. They are universal stories told from a new perspective. Films like The Woman King, Black Panther, Queen Sono, Blood and Water, Shantytown, Anikulapo, and others have not only featured African narratives, but have shifted how Africa is portrayed on the global screen, moving away from outdated stereotypes of poverty and war into complex stories of resilience, kingdom, innovation, spirituality, family, and identity. Nollywood, which started as a grassroots video industry with small budgets and fast production, has now become a cultural empire that has shaped how African families see themselves and how the world sees Africa, exporting African values, drama, music, and languages across continents and into diaspora communities worldwide. But this cultural explosion didn't just appear overnight. It grew from years of creative resistance, cultural pride, and young African creators deciding that they didn't need Western institutions to validate them. They needed digital platforms, cultural confidence, and global connected youth audiences. Social media played a huge role. Platforms like TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter allowed African creators to bypass traditional gatekeepers and speak directly to global audiences, building their own followings, virality, and cultural power without needing Western approval, and this changed everything. Dance trends from Lagos, Accra, Johannesburg, and Nairobi now spread worldwide within days, with TikTok dances driven by African music dominating global timelines, influencing how teenagers in Brazil, the United States, Korea, and Europe move, talk, dress, and express themselves. Even global beauty standards are being reshaped. African models, dark skin tones, natural hair, African features, and Afrocentric beauty are receiving global recognition, shifting the international beauty industry toward broader representation and authentic African beauty, something that was historically excluded or marginalized. What we are witnessing is Africa controlling its soft power, and soft power is one of the most important forms of global influence today, because culture shapes how countries are perceived, how young people think, and how future generations choose their alliances, ideas, and dreams. Through music, film, and fashion, Africa is influencing how the world sees cool, how the world sees beauty, how the world sees rhythm, and even how the world sees success. And that is far more powerful than any military weapon or trade deal, because culture enters people's emotions, homes, and identities. The reason this matters globally is because cultural power often comes before political and economic power, and history shows this clearly. The United States dominated global culture before it dominated the world economically. Japan used anime and technology to build global image. Korea used K-pop and dramas to expand influence. And now Africa is entering its own global soft power moment. And unlike previous cultural powers, Africa's rise is not driven by a single country or corporation. It is collective, decentralized, youth-led, and digitally driven, coming from Lagos, Accra, Johannesburg, Nairobi, Kampala, Dakar, and beyond, making it a cultural wave that is difficult to stop, control, or silence. This matters for the future because Africa has the youngest population in the world, with over 60% of its population under 25 years old, meaning that the next generation of global creators, artists, designers, filmmakers, and digital innovators will heavily come from Africa, and they are already shaping global culture while still being underrepresented in global power structures. Global companies have noticed this, which is why major music labels, fashion houses, film studios, and tech companies are moving into African creative markets, opening African divisions, signing African talent, and investing in African storytelling, because they know that Africa is not just a market. Africa is the source of future global culture. But the most powerful part of this cultural explosion is that Africa is no longer only exporting culture. Africa is redefining identity for Africans themselves, helping young Africans reconnect with pride, language, tradition, and creativity in a way that was damaged by colonial history and cultural imperialism. Young Africans are now embracing their names, their languages, their hairstyles, their native fashion, their music, and their stories with pride, because they now see it celebrated globally. And this internal transformation is just as important as global recognition, because a culture that believes in itself becomes unstoppable. This is why Africa's cultural explosion is not just entertainment. It is a cultural revolution. It is Africa telling its own story to the world without filters, without permission, and without apology. And the world is not just watching. The world is consuming, participating, and adapting. You see it when Beyoncé creates an entire visual album inspired by African royalty and aesthetics. You see it when global designers base collections on African patterns and silhouettes. You see it when international festivals headline African performers. And you see it when African series trend globally on streaming platforms. And yet this is only the beginning, because Africa's creative industries are still young compared to Western industries, which means their growth potential is massive. And as infrastructure, technology, investment, and education expand across the continent, the creative output will multiply even more. In the next decade, Africa will likely produce global fashion giants, music production empires, film studios, digital art leaders, and creative tech companies that define entertainment, design, and media worldwide. And what we're seeing now is the earliest phase of something much bigger. Africa is no longer waiting to be discovered. Africa is broadcasting itself. Africa is exporting itself. Africa is redefining global cool. And whether the world accepts it slowly or quickly, one truth is clear: the cultural gravity has shifted. The secret is out, but the explosion has just begun. And Africa is not just part of the global culture anymore. Africa is becoming one of its main architects, and the world is already dancing, dressing, and watching in its rhythm without even fully realizing it yet. You've been watching Echoes of Africa, where every story carries the sound of tomorrow. If this moved you, subscribe now, like, and share so Africa's voice never fades into silence.